Today on Stronger Than Reason, we get on the fence with Ministries. The mind is a terrible thing to taste. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. Okay, I'm sure you've all seen this coming because it was inevitable, wasn't it, ever since way back in episode 1. Even from that very first episode a year ago, I made it clear that this was a band that was important to me. In fact, they're central to this show's mission, which, after all, is to talk about the electronic, industrial, and alternative music of the 80s and 90s. And as such, this band was situated nicely in the center of that world. The late 80s were the sweet spot for this band. That's when they came out with what I think were their 3 best albums. Albums that were, in many ways, landmarks for industrial rock as a whole. They'd provide the template that other bands would crib from for years to come. And the band, of course, is Ministry, led by the intrepid Al Jourgensen. Of course, their first album was With Sympathy back in 1983, which was molded, as Al says, by his then label Arista, into commercial synth pop. Al eventually broke free of Arista to sign with Sire. Twitch came out in 1986 as his statement of sorts. It was harsher with some industrial noises and an emphasis on drums and samples. But a couple years later, he came out with a pair of albums that were released just a year apart, both of which were well ahead of their time and would, for a bit, place Ministry in the forefront of the scene. The Land of Rape and Honey came out in 1988. As we discussed in episode 34, it is Ministry's most critically acclaimed album and a fan favorite, if not their most commercial success. It defined the next generation of industrial sounds, ramping the aggression factor into territory previously only inhabited by metal and hardcore punk, and it managed to blend aspects of all of these genres into a new thing, industrial rock, and there was much rejoicing. I also talked about how Al and his new partner, Paul Barker, weren't limited to Ministry. Around this time, they spun off a half dozen other projects, all exploring aspects of this sound. Episode 23 dove into those side projects. For instance, they also toured and released records as The Revolting Cocks, which was more or less Ministry's sister band composed of many of the same people. And I dove into 2 of their albums in episodes 18 and 41. So really the only thing left for me to talk about with respect to Ministry in this era is their 4th studio album, the one that came out just 12 months after The Land of Rape and Honey, the one that would prove that album wasn't just a fluke, the one that would nudge Ministry's sound that much closer to metal, the one that begat maybe the most iconic tour in the history of industrial music. Of course, I'm talking about The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. Or, as Chris Connolly called it in his book, the name is an embarrassing thing to say. Reportedly, the rest of the band weren't really pleased with Al's title. And how do I know that? Because I tracked down this November 2011 issue of Decibel magazine, which features a multi-page interview with all the principal contributors to the Mind album and their thoughts on it after 21 years. And it features Al, Paul, Chris, Bill Rieflin, and Ogre, and really paints a picture of what was going on at the time, which we'll get into because it was a lot. Of course, coming out in 1989 means this album will turn 35 this year, which is hard to believe. But, you know, that's what I said at my 30th high school reunion. Just kidding, because I didn't go to my 30th reunion. In fact, I don't even think we had one. But for now, let's start at the beginning. As we do, or at least with my beginning with this album. When did I first hear it, and what did I think? I actually heard Mind alongside Land. In fact, I put them on each side of a single cassette tape, and it was perhaps the most played tape in my collection for a period of time. But even then, the 2 albums had different feels. Land was cleaner, much more synth and sample-oriented. Mind was rockier, with more guitar. But my real impression of these albums wouldn't crystallize until I watched their live video, In Case You Didn't Feel Like Showing Up, which came out shortly after Mind. I don't actually own that show now on any media. I think I might have owned the VHS tape at one point, but I don't seem to anymore. I got rid of a lot of VHS tapes over the years. Regardless, it's all on YouTube and anyone can watch it at any time now, of course. And it was, to us at the time, an instant classic. It was required viewing among my friends. And I definitely can't separate in my mind the experience of listening to these albums and watching the video. They might have all happened around the same time. I just really can't remember. But the video showcased 8 songs. There were 4 from Land and 4 from Mind. So as such, it was perfectly balanced. And weirdly, the CD would eliminate 2 of those songs, 1 from each album. But more importantly, the video would highlight who was in ministry at the time and their overall presentation, their stage show, which was largely on the theme of Mad Max in Hell. and I was totally in on this. I had never seen or heard a band like this before. There were aspects of metal and hardcore punk, but the overall sound was broader. There were synths and samples under everything. It wasn't just metal chugging. It wasn't just shredding. There was more going on, and it had a lot of energy, and it was kick-ass, undeniably so. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to the video later. Within the context of listening to this material for the first time, what stood out to me about Mind, about the songs on this album in particular, it actually struck me as being fairly uneven. Some of the songs were obviously great, some were less so. Mind sounded like a band getting pulled in different directions without overall coordination. And in fact, it turned out that was the case, as I later learned. Al described this album in his memoir as the time when he started hitting hard drugs, namely heroin. And even though he had the final say on everything that went out as ministry, he was not as directly involved with each song on this album as he was on Land. Some of these songs had significant input from others simply because Al was distracted or just didn't care. At its best, though, this album extended the sounds on Land, making them rockier. Unlike Land, this album sounded like a rock band at the core with extra layers and sounds added on that bass. Every song here was, for the most part, built on the holy trinity of guitar, bass, and drums. But overall, I found I liked this album a lot, even though there were a few songs I always skipped over. On the other hand, I rarely skipped over anything on Land, so yeah, can't rate Mind as high, but that's not saying much because Land is arguably Ministry's greatest album and certainly one of the greatest industrial albums of all time, so there's really no shame in not matching it. So let's dive into the album. First, as we do, let's look at the artwork. The Decibel article tells the story here. Evidently, the X-rays came from the mother of the receptionist in Chicago Track Studios, who was unfortunately in a near-fatal car crash, and Al saw these X-rays one day and was just delighted that they showed metal plates and screws in this poor woman's head. So forget PHI and HIPAA. This lady's X-ray is now a Ministry album cover. So this is another one of those albums with the booklet that folds out in a really irritating way. So let's try to figure this out here. I don't know why they just can't make booklets for everything. I mean, no one really displays these as posters, do they? I know I didn't. And refolding it is always a fun time. So if this is the outside, the one that has the front and back album cover, then the outside also has this color side view and the track list with some even more annoying little icons that sort of indicate who played what. And I know it's pretty hard to see here, but there are 9 tracks. And if we flip it over, we get the more detailed album info. No lyrics, though. But the thing I want to point out here is just how few people contributed to this album proper. I mean, we all know that the tour had 9 or more musicians on stage at any given time, but the credits here just list a few people. And we have Al and Paul, of course, as Ministry proper. 2 additional musicians. We have Bill Rieflin on drums and programming. Of course, Bill was pretty much a full member by this point, but for some reason, Al never really listed him as such. And we have Mars Williams on sax on just one track. And Mars, if you don't know, was a sax man for hire, and he played with a lot of bands over the years, maybe most notably for the Psychedelic Furs throughout the 80s. And I'm sorry to report that he recently passed away in November 2023 of cancer, and he was only 68 years old. So R.I.P. Mars. The two folks listed as additional vocalists here are Chris Connolly, of course, on 2 tracks, and somewhat controversially, the Grand Wizard K. Light, who provided vocals on just 1 track. And no, the controversy there wasn't about him calling himself a Grand Wizard, though come to think of it, that's a pretty sketchy thing in itself. But we'll talk about his contributions soon. Then there's another bunch of folks here who contributed background vocals. I'm not going to go through each one, but we had Joe Kelly, who is a skateboarder kind of guy. Jeff Ward, of course, who was Al's other regular drummer. And Dave Rave Ogilvy, who, of course, is Skinny Puppy's producer, who also did engineering on this album. And later, he would be more famous for producing Call Me Maybe. And interestingly, Al's future ex-wife, Angela Lucasen. So not listed here are the rest of the folks who famously sat on the Mind tour, like guitarists Mike Scasia, Terry Roberts, and William Tucker, or drummer Martin Atkins. None evidently had anything to do with writing or recording this album. However, one individual oddly appears with a songwriting credit, but not for performing on the album, and that individual is Kevin Ogilvy, aka Ogre, from Skinny Puppy. And I should point out that he's listed as a songwriter on 2 tracks, but is not listed as a vocalist at all. But strangely, David Ogilvy, aka Rave, the Puppy producer, no relation to Ogre, is listed as a vocalist. And I wonder if that's an error. I'm not aware of Rave ever really being a vocalist. And obviously it's Ogre among those singing these songs on the live video. And you really can't tell from listening to it, though, since they layered so many vocals. So who knows? I'm thinking they might have left Ogre's name off this for the same reason he didn't get a credit for singing Get Down on Revco's Beer, Steers, and Queers, which was reportedly due to his record contract. Or it might have just been an oversight in the general fog of war. Hard to say. But my point is that this album was written and recorded by fewer people than went on the tour. So Scasia, Atkins, and Tucker weren't on the album. They were just hired guns for the tour. So let me see if I can get this put back together. All right. That's always so much fun. That's why I never take that thing out. So let's talk a bit more about the state of the band at this time. In short, it wasn't great. Al described it as degeneration into complete chaos. In reality, he started using heroin, and for the most part, the rest of the band were not hard drug abusers, so there was some division in the ranks. Essentially, it was Al's merry band of drug buddies and various hangers-on versus what Al called the book club, namely Paul, Chris, and Bill. And Al claims he wasn't getting on with Paul at all. He hated him at the time, and who knows if that's true, but the fact is they worked well enough together to produce this album and play over 40 shows on the subsequent tour. So I wonder if Al's insistence on hating everyone and dismissing the music as real or just theater. Chris Connolly for sure paints Al as being pretty bipolar. He was either your best buddy one day or your biggest hater. For sure, it sounds like being around Al was an emotional roller coaster. But, you know, as we've seen with Skinny Puppy and other bands, that kind of animosity brings its own tension to the music and maybe can wind up being good for the art, if not great for your own mental health. So who knows? I'm not sure we'll ever get the full unvarnished picture unless and until Paul Barker writes his memoir, which, despite being in the so-called book club, doesn't appear to be happening anytime soon. And that's another point. Al wrote a book. So isn't he in the book club now? I mean, pot, meat kettle, I don't know, what the hell. Bill points out in the Decibel interview that ultimately this album was made by a group of people, and that's just a fact. However, Ministry proper was always portrayed as Al and Paul, so it doesn't really seem fair, and I'm not sure why Al was so reluctant to expand the band roster in the early years when clearly other people were making significant contributions. And that isn't the case now, for instance, because dozens of people have been in Ministry since the 1990s. But the bottom line is this. With Land, Al had his hand in all aspects of the album's creation, And with Mind, he started delegating most of the work and made himself kind of just the final arbiter of what went out. So his role changed, and the result was an album that was more uneven. So that's enough context. Let's talk about the music. So this album has 9 songs and is just over 50 minutes, so it's on the longish side for an album released in 1989. And you may recall that Land had 2 bonus tracks that only appeared on CD. Mind has just 1 bonus track. It's the final track, Dream Song. It's not on the vinyl, but is on the CD and cassette, so it's sort of a bonus track. But that's kind of getting ahead of things. We have to start at the beginning with the lead-off track, which is Thieves. This, of course, is now one of Ministry's signature tunes, and maybe more than any other track indicates the direction they were headed. Guitar-wise, it's nothing complicated at all. It's really just 30-second note riffing on E. Vocally, it's got shouted lyrics by someone. I don't know, it's Al or Joe Kelly, or maybe it's a bunch of people blended together. It's really hard to tell because they're so distorted. But whoever it is going on some sort of rant about politicians. Again, no lyrics, so it's kind of hard to piece together what's being said. But the rhythm is the great thing here. To paraphrase the old joke, it's got 3 speeds: slow, medium, and blow my brains out. So for sure, this was a favorite at shows for anyone who was down in the pit. And there are all sorts of samples going on here, like what sounds like a dentist drill, and a lot of clips of the drill instructor character from Full Metal Jacket. And it just occurred to me that there are 2 drills, the tool and the drill instructor, and I wonder if that was intended as a pun. Probably not. Anyway, it's a pretty aggressive song, and like Stigmata on Land, just a great opener. It's like a real statement of intent. Chris Connolly wrote about this song's genesis in his memoir. Al called him one day saying, "Man, you got to come over here. I just wrote the greatest song ever." And so Chris duly went over and listened and kind of had to agree with him. It was a killer song. The problem was the fast parts were so fast that no one could sing it properly. That is, until they got Joe Kelly in. Now, who is Joe Kelly exactly? Chris keeps referring to him as an annoying skateboard kid, so maybe he was a pro skater or some skate guy. I have no idea. Google isn't much help. But he's definitely in the live video singing Thieves, so I guess there's that. Next up is another classic, one that would be picked for a single, which is Burning Inside. Al says this track started as an idea by the book club, so evidently the 2 teams, Al's and Paul's, would work separate shifts in the studio, 12 hours and 12 hours. And so after Paul's team would come up with ideas, Al would come in and just, try to subvert them. And sometimes this would work, as it did for Burning Inside, and sometimes it would fail miserably, as we'll see. But the coolest thing by far about this song is the drum track, which is all thanks to Bill Rieflin. It's fast, it's tribal, has multiple parts playing over each other, and I'm not sure, but this might have been the impetus to get another drummer for the tour, because it'd be pretty impossible to recreate this with just one drummer, unless it's Neil Peart, R.I.P. But yeah, great hooks here, more guitar riffing, another fast, aggressive song. I'm pretty sure Al sings this one, if I recall. On the single, which was vinyl only, Thieves was on the B side. And in the Decibel interview, Al says he had a private joke about this song because he always kind of thought of it as Bernie and Size, like it was an ad for a little Jewish deli, $5 fries at Bernie and Size, which is actually pretty decent humor from Al, you got to admit. I guess he just took any opportunity to throw shade at the book club, at least back in 2011 when that interview came out. But they did make a video for this song that was more or less a staged version of their live show. If I recall, they brought in a bunch of random people from the street into the practice area and gave a quasi concert and had the band playing behind the now iconic fence. Lots of shots of fire, blowtorches, a guy strapped to a wheel, Al singing in his now standard cowboy hat. What's not to like? Track 3 is Never Believe. This is another aggressive number with really heavy guitars and drums, this time with Chris Connolly wailing a lot of stuff over the top. who knows what he's saying. He's mostly just ranting like a madman. There's a lot of proper industrial sounding clanking going on in this tune, and a pretty weird herky-jerky rhythm. I remember a couple of my friends listening to this for the first time, and they weren't Ministry fans at all. I was playing mine for them, and I was trying to win them over, and they started dancing the robot to this song. And damn it, I could never quite enjoy it in the same way again. They pretty much ruined it for me, the bastards. But yeah, I did dig it pretty well before that happened, so I imagine other fans probably like this song too. Next up is Cannibal Song. This is another Chris Connolly joint. It's more of a down-tempo tune that features a groovy bass line courtesy of Paul Barker. Lots of different sounds here, samples of crows, some cool sax courtesy of Mars Williams. In short, it's really kind of a breath of air after the 1-2-3 punch of the openers. I don't think I've ever heard of them playing Never Believe or Cannibal Song live, though, so in my mind they aren't quite on the same tier as Thieves or Burning Inside, but still pretty cool, and definitely not the worst songs in this album, as we'll see. Track 5 is Breathe, which of course is now a classic, largely due to its appearance in Case You Didn't Feel Like Showing Up as the opening track, the best part of which, of course, is the dual drum jam between Bill and Martin, which isn't on the album version, sad to say. Otherwise, this song is pretty standard Ministry fare for the time. It's a mid-tempo rocker, lots of delay in the vocals, which Al liked to do for some reason, like a whole note of delay, which is a lot. Breathe is a proper pop song. It's got like a verse, chorus, verse structure, so it's fairly traditional in that way. But yeah, a really cool song, hard-hitting, showcases the new Ministry sound very well. My favorite thing about it, though, is the synth part. It's got someone playing a single high synth pad note through the whole song. It's just the same note, just holding it down for 5 minutes. And it's funny because it actually works. It adds a necessary bit of tension to the entire thing. So very cool. Then, of course, we have the classic So What, which according to Paul was the only song here that resulted from musicians bothering to play instruments in a live room at the same time. This is another song that's fronted by Chris Connolly. But equally important are the vocal samples, which were cribbed from a 1956 movie called The Violent Years, which was written by Ed Wood, that, no kidding, is about a gang of really mean high school girls. And you can actually watch the entire movie from its Wikipedia page. Again, The Violent Years. It's fun to scroll to the very end to just hear the judge speak the lines that were sampled for So What. Apart from that, So What is a slowish groove propelled by Paul's really killer bass line and Bill's syncopated drums, with occasional bursts of double-time thrashing, of course, just to wake you up. And this is also the longest song on the album at over 8 minutes. So next up is maybe the most controversial song, which is Test. By all accounts, Bill Rieflin played all the instruments on this, and at first, it was regarded by Chris and Paul as a real breakthrough. Musically, it's especially hard-hitting and took Ministry's aggression to the next level, and all it needed was a solid vocal. So Al, being Al, came in on his studio shift and, getting another track from the book club, decided to add his own twist. See, he had made friends with some guys in the studio next door who were evidently rappers, so Mr. Collaboration invited one of them, K Light, to come over and rap to Test. And that's what we have here. So can we call this the first metal rap song? I'm not sure, but it's definitely a contender. And who knows, we might have Al to blame for Limp Bizkit. So props to him for inspiring Fred Durst, I guess. But the rest of the band hated the result and were convinced that the rap, A, didn't fit on the album, and B, sank all of Bill's hard work, reducing his masterpiece to a skippable joke. And maybe the proof of it is that this song did indeed sink without a trace. According to Setlist FM, they only played this song live 3 times, all on the Mine tour, and I kind of have to wonder if Al tried to live rap on it. But anyway, I don't hate this track. It's not one of my favorites on this album. I do like hip-hop myself, some of it, so I'm not going to dunk on this just because it has a rap. However, I do agree that it's a bit jarring in the context of this album, which frankly is just more about screaming than rapping. Musically, this song does have a cool backing track. It reminds me a bit of Flashback from Land, and to me kind of fills the same sort of niche on this album. And honestly, you have to give Al credit for trying something new, even if it maybe didn't work or if it didn't meet everyone's expectations. And, props to Bill for making such a banging track. Frankly, it's really impressive that he did it all on his own. And, for those who would like to hear more of Mr. Rieflin's solo work, I highly recommend this album, which is Birth of a Giant. He did just about everything on this album. And in fact, you can hear him do some lead vocals too, which is pretty rad. Again, Bill was a super talented guy. Later in his career, he did a lot of interesting things. He co-founded Pigface with Martin Atkins. He played with King Crimson, Swans, KMFDM, Robin Hitchcock. He did some side projects with Robert Fripp, as you do. And of course, he was REM's drummer for many years. Again, as you do. He even drummed on a Taylor Swift song called The Last Time, which came out in 2012. So he was all over the place. So check out his music. There's a lot to dig into. All right, we're getting there. Track 8 is Faith Collapsing. This is one of the few Ministry songs in waltz time. It's a pretty cool track with a lot of samples from the movie version of 1984. And as Chris tells it, the struggle with this song was coming up with the name. So to fit the music, it had to have a particular rhythm. And evidently the band listened to this backing track on loop for hours, everyone sitting with a notepad on his lap, brainstorming anything that would fit, until someone, mercifully, and we don't know who, suggested Faith Collapsing. And it was good. And this song has never been played live, but I think it's one of the better tunes in this album. It's creepy, it's menacing, and again, with that waltz time, it just makes it feel a bit off kilter, which is really cool. So finally, we round things out with Dream Song. Al and Paul state in the Decibel interview that they always like to end their albums on a more contemplative note, relatively speaking. So this song is a bit of odd ambience with rambling vocals by Al's to-be and later ex-wife, Angela Lucassen. And the story goes that Al found her entertaining, i.e. totally unhinged, so would call her while on tour and just let her ramble. I guess in this case he did that and she was really high and was just reading her poetry about angels or something. And sure enough, Al turned that into a song. And there's not much more to say about it. It's not really one of my favorites here, but that's it. 9 songs, and in my mind, the best of them more than make up for the worst, making this a classic Ministry album indeed. Hell, this album could have just had Thieves burning inside and So What, and it would have been an instant classic in my book. The rest of this stuff is just gravy. So of course I need to talk a bit about In Case You Didn't Feel Like Showing Up. This is the live presentation of songs from Land and Mind, and it came out a few months later after Mind in February 1990 on both VHS and audio formats. And strangely, I don't remember who among my friends bought this. I think maybe a few of us probably had it in different formats. I do have a lot of fond memories, though, of us sitting in my old basement rec room, watching it endlessly and scrutinizing like every frame, because these guys who are on tour were heroes to us, and it was a real revelation to see them play this music live. And as I mentioned, Al padded the band with extra musicians for the tour, so at any given moment you had 8 to 10 people on stage. And this was the first tour with the iconic chain-link fence, which separated the band from the audience and provided, a prop for each side to climb up on. A lot has been said about this tour. Both Al and Chris wrote about it in their memoirs. Of these, Chris's memories are more coherent. Al's mostly dismissive of this entire era, just choosing instead to focus on his stupid drug use. Chris, on the other hand, tells some great tour anecdotes and isn't afraid to dish the bad with the good, even making fun of himself at times. He's certainly not putting himself on any kind of pedestal. So he describes the misbehavior of certain parties, the time the band was run out of Utah with a warning to never come back, playing in a strip mall in Florida to a bunch of goths with fake palm trees all around them, everyone getting shots at the doctors because someone on the tour caught hepatitis and turned yellow. It's like a lot of good stuff. And for the millionth time, if you have any interest in Ministry or Revco and haven't read Chris's book, what the hell are you even doing? Like, go get it right now and read it. My friends and I never saw Ministry live back in the day, so in case you didn't feel like showing up was our window into that world, and we were just fascinated by it. To us, every member of the band was like someone from Batman's Rogues Gallery, and we all kind of had our favorites. All these folks had their own personalities and were famous in their own way. So you had Al, who was the ringleader, wearing his cowboy hat and shades, and Paul was the cool guy on bass. Bill was the solid drummer who was wearing a shirt and tie for some reason. Martin was the wacky drummer who always wore the same striped shirt for some reason and seemed to be playing a kit that was mostly scrap metal. And Chris was this lanky white guy with dreadlocks, also wearing a suit. And of course you had Ogre, who was as elusive as ever, mostly hiding in the shadows, but we loved his shirt, which said, F Art, Let's Kill. Later, I would realize that it was a shirt for the band ChemLab, which was maybe a little too subtle for us to figure out at the time. And then you had any number of guitarists. You had Mikey Scasia, who was your standard guitar guy with the long black hair, and Terry Roberts, who evidently was from the UK subs. Maybe the less said about that guy, the better. And of course, you had the special guest, the one and only Jello Biafra, who came out toward the end of the set to give his special version of the Pledge of Allegiance. I guess Al brought him along on the tour to sing a few Lard songs. Of course, Lard was one of many Ministry side projects, which we discussed in episode 23. So it's hard to recall now just how fresh and inventive that music and look was back in 1990. Alternative music at the time was mostly lighter fare, and aggressive music was mostly limited to metal. So some of us knew that Ministry was making this blistering music, but it took actually seeing them in that video to drive that weirdness home. Ministry had aspects of a lot of different styles, but it, obviously wasn't pure metal, because pure metal, speed, thrash, death metal, or whatever, it didn't have all these damn keyboards, and it didn't have loops, and it didn't have samples from horror movies and Full Metal Jacket. So Ministry popularized the idea of hard, aggressive music that wasn't based on just the rock instruments. And the fact that it wasn't immediately pigeonholed made it transgressive and exciting, because metalheads didn't quite know what to make of it. Club kids didn't quite know what to make of it. Your mom didn't quite know what to make of it, especially after seeing an album title like The Land of Rape and Honey. Trust me, I know that from experience. In some sense, it seemed like this band came out of nowhere and just invented a whole new genre. And of course, in retrospect, we can see that Ministry was just pushing the bounds of industrial, laying claim to new territory, and Mine was just the latest example of that. But all of this seemed kind of cool and dangerous and exciting at the time. The idea of mashing up genres into something that was aggressive and powerful, but in a different new way. And if you think about it, that hadn't really happened since punk came around in 76 and 77. So, to some extent, my friends and I were happy to glom onto Ministry simply because it kicked ass, but it was also because no one else seemed to understand it, and we were able to kind of claim it as our own. Ministry didn't easily fit into any simple category at the time, and in today's terms, we'd say they were being disruptive, or they were changing paradigms. And they'd more or less keep doing that until they played Lollapalooza in 1992. And by then, in some ways, they would have jumped the shark, or at least they'd be squarely pigeonholed into that new industrial rock category. But I want to mention another thing about in case you didn't feel like showing up. And I kind of mentioned it before. It's odd what was included and what was left out. So the video has 8 songs plus Jello's Flag Pledge. So you have Breathe, The Missing Deity, So What, Burning Inside, Thieves, Stigmata, and The Land of Rape and Honey. And for some reason, they left Breathe and The Land of Rape and Honey off the CD and tape, along with the Flag Pledge. So you only got 6 songs. And that seemed like a bit of a ripoff. So what we did was we dubbed the video onto cassette so we could listen to the whole thing. None of these releases had the side project songs either. So on this tour, not only were they playing Lard songs like The Power of Lard and Hell Fudge and Time to Melt, but they'd also play Palehead songs like Man Should Surrender and No Bunny. And they did a cover of PIL's Public Image, and they'd have Ogre front Ministry's cover of Skinny Puppy's Smothered Hope. Fortunately, complete sets from this era showed up on bootlegs like Power Department and Live Necronomicon, so you can hear them in all their glory. And the interesting thing is that the bootlegs have the raw audio without the overdubs, so you can easily see that Al did quite a lot of work to clean up the sound on in case you didn't feel like showing up, to sound more like the albums. And that's pretty much what he says he did with the Revco live album too. To me, though, I think it's more interesting to hear the actual live versions with the mistakes and all. So check those out if you haven't heard them. I think they're a more honest representation of the live band around this time. So why do I love it? Well, of course, this is classic Ministry. Is it flawless? No. But again, the best parts, I think, more than make up for the worst. To me, this album was an antidote to other heavy music at the time, metal stuff like Metallica, Megadeth, Overkill. It showed how music could be heavy without being just rock. This music wasn't about guitar heroics. It wasn't heavy because of drop D shredding and Cookie Monster vocals. There was something different going on. And that lack of familiarity was off-putting, but also really interesting. The music was hard to categorize. Industrial wasn't a commonly recognized term at the time. This was some sort of weird hybrid between electronic music, metal, and punk with a dystopian sci-fi vibe going on. And I think it spoke to kids who were in that alternative scene already. Your goths, your emo kids. So Ministry became our Metallica in the way that they were the best example of this new genre or whatever it was, even though that genre didn't really have a good name at the time. But whatever it was, for sure, no one was doing it on the scale of Ministry. I mean, 9 people on stage. And by the way, one of them is the singer for Skinny Puppy. So the lineup on this tour was really hard to beat. No one else was playing this new aggressive sort of music with that kind of horsepower. Not even Nine Inch Nails. Remember, back in 1989, they were just coming out with Pretty Hate Machine, which was a great album, but nowhere near as hard-hitting as Mind. And Trent is the first one to say that at the time, he felt like a poser compared to the guys in Ministry who were really doing it. And on that Pretty Hate Machine tour, I think Trent had 3 or 4 people on stage, not 9. But yeah, so Ministry were uniquely positioned when this album came out. They were definitely at the front of the pack, maybe for the last time in their career. And to me, Mind represents the completion of the journey the band started with Land. The two go together and are perfectly captured with the live album. And to me, nothing they would do later would ever really have the same spark to it. It would all veer a little too close to generic metal for my tastes, and the later lineups just wouldn't really compare. Mine was the last album to feature that original magic sauce, and that's why I love it. So where are they now? The current incarnation of Ministry is going on tour around the U.S. this spring in 2024. They're headlining, but are also touring with Gary Newman and Frontline Assembly, which sounds like a pretty awesome show to me, so catch them if you can. They've been regularly playing songs from the Land and Mind albums on tour for the past few years. I mean, I caught them on Slayer's final tour a couple years ago, and the set list was very retro heavy. Of course, Paul is still around. He most recently opened on Skinny Puppy's final tour with his own act, Led Into Gold. I talked about that in episode 21. And of course, he's still running his effects company, Maleko Heavy Industries. Chris, of course, has his solo career. He's released something like 24 solo albums. Few, if any, are in the industrial genre. His solo stuff is more eclectic in a Scott Walker or David Bowie kind of way. All really good stuff that I highly recommend. I will definitely talk about it here in time. Bill, R.I.P., what more can I say? And Ogre, now enjoying more free time now that Skinny Puppy has ended. I'm sure he's doing something like cooking up his next solo album. Martin Atkins is doing Martin stuff. He's always got a bunch of side hustles going on, running Invisible Records, writing books about band business, teaching classes about the music industry, and evidently running a museum of post-punk and industrial music in Chicago. I think he's probably just got his storage unit there with a ticket line out front. I don't know. Well, there you have it, folks. Another classic Ministry album. The Mind is a terrible thing to taste. You knew I would get to it eventually. I mean, how couldn't I? And I just want to say thank you to everyone who gave feedback to last episode's intermission. You all provided me with a bunch of cool ideas that I'll be pursuing. And, you really gave me a bunch more CDs to buy. I wonder if I'm the only one still buying them anymore. The funny thing is that I'm running out of shelf space, and I'm probably going to have to buy some more, so I foresee an IKEA run in my near future. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, where we are gamely trudging into the new year, despite various stomach illnesses and the grim reality of having to go back to work. Can't let it get you down, though, folks. Just remember, only 10 weeks until spring. If we stick together, it'll go fast. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.